The moment stretched like pulled wire, thin and about to snap. 1 second, Remy Doust, the man who had bought half of Vancouver's waterfront and never once said please in his adult life, was laughing, his hand clamped around the wrist of the woman refilling his coffee. The next, the laughter stopped. There was a sharp intake of breath from the table behind him, the clean sound of a joint being torqued past its limit, and then Remy Doust, who owned the building they were standing in, was on his knees on the hardwood floor of his own private dining room, staring at the grain of the wood and trying to remember how to breathe. The server stood over him, her apron still perfectly tied, her coffee pot still in her other hand. She had not spilled a drop. "I asked you to let go," she said quietly, and the room understood that something had changed. The Meridian Club sat at the top of a glass tower in Cole Harbour, and on a Tuesday evening in November it smelled of cedar smoke, aged Bordeaux, and the particular kind of entitlement that settled into a room like weather. Ava Renault had worked the private dining floor for 6 weeks, long enough to know the layout by heart, long enough to know which exit took you to the service corridor, which table had the sight line to the door, and which regulars tipped in cash versus card. She had taken the job because the health insurance started at 90 days, and her brother Theo had a surgery scheduled for the 2nd week of February. That was the whole calculation. Get to 90 days, keep your head down. Don't be interesting. She was 28. With dark hair she kept pinned back in a way that made her look severe when she wasn't smiling and approachable when she was. She had learned to deploy the smile like a tool. The right amount at the right moment, not too warm. Warmth invited conversation, and conversation invited questions she did not want to answer. The private dining room seated 12 and was reserved, on Tuesday evenings, for Remy Doust and whoever he chose to bring with him. Tonight there were 7 of them, men in suits that had been made for their bodies, not bought off a rack. A woman who wore her diamonds the way other people wore reading glasses, purely functional, just something you put on. And Remy Doust himself, at the head of the table, looking like a man who had never in his life been told to wait. He was in his mid-50s, broad-shouldered, with silver hair combed back from a face that must have been handsome once, and had since calcified into authority. He spoke in the low, unhurried cadence of someone who knew the room would be quiet when he chose to fill it. He did not look at the servers. Not once in 6 weeks had he looked at Ava directly. Until tonight, she was refilling his coffee, a gesture she'd performed dozens of times, the pot angled correctly, a cloth tucked under the spout to catch drips, when his hand shot out and closed around her wrist. Not a grab. Worse than a grab, a possession. The kind of grip that said I can and so I will. Not yet, he said, not looking up from whatever conversation he was continuing at his right. I'll tell you when. Ava went very still. The pot was heavy. The grip was tighter than it needed to be. The man to Remy's left was already turning away, already not cis, which was its own kind of information. She said evenly, "Mr. Doust, please release my wrist." He heard her. She could tell by the slight shift in his jaw. He just didn't respond. He finished his sentence to the man on his right, something about a zoning appeal, something about the city being manageable, and only then did he tighten his grip further and look up at her with the flat, incurious stare of a man conducting an inspection. "You're new?" he said. 6 weeks, you interrupted me. I asked you to let go." His eyebrows rose a fraction, not anger. Surprise, people apparently did not often ask him to let go. He studied her in the same way he might study an unexpected item on an invoice. Not threatened, exactly, but annoyed that something required his attention that should have been seamless. "What's your name?" Ava, he repeated. "You have a steady hand. Most people shake. Most people haven't asked you to stop twice." The table went quiet. Not all at once. It rippled. One conversation dying and then the next like lights going out down a corridor. The woman with the diamonds set down her fork. Remy Doust looked at Ava for another long moment, and then the corner of his mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile. "Strong opinion for someone carrying a coffee pot," he said. He pulled her wrist forward, enough to cause her to overbalance, and the pot tipped. Hot coffee ran across the white tablecloth, pooling around the breadbasket, soaking the cuff of his jacket. The sound of it, the liquid hiss, the collective inhale from the table, was somehow louder than anything that had come before. Remy looked down at the spreading stain, then back at Ava. "That," he said softly, "is going to be a problem for you." He stood. He was taller than she'd registered from across the room. He moved into her space with the casual certainty of a man who had never once considered that a space might not welcome him. "Do you know what it cost to replace this suit? Do you have any idea? You've just made yourself very expensive, and I am very bad at absorbing unexpected costs." He reached out and lifted her chin with 2 fingers, tilting her face up toward his. The gesture was deliberate, a demonstration. "See how easy this is. Apologize, nicely, and we'll call it a lesson learned." The room was holding its breath. Something settled in Ava's chest. Not rage. She'd been trained past rage, trained to somewhere colder and more useful. She recognized the feeling. It was the same thing that happened the moment before she decided to move. She said very clearly, "Take your hand off my face. This is the last time I'll say it gently." Remy Daoust laughed. A real laugh, genuine and condescending and pleased with itself. He looked around the table. "Did you hear that? This woman, can you believe?" And when he turned back, his expression had cured into something harder. "Last time you'll say it gently," he repeated. "Let's see the other version." He made the mistake of tightening his grip. Ava moved. It was not what anyone expected. Not the table, not the man at the door, not Remy Daoust, who had been physically dominant his entire life and had never had cause to believe that a server carrying a coffee pot would be his reckoning. She used his own leverage against him. Her free hand clamped over his, 2 fingers finding the pressure point between the knuckle joints, and she rotated, a controlled arc that forced his wrist into an angle it was not designed for. He made a sound. She was already pivoting, her weight dropping into the movement, and then she swept his lead foot and guided him down. Not a fall. A directed descent, controlled, almost precise, as if she were setting something fragile on a shelf. Remy Daoust ended up on one knee on the floor of his private dining room. The other hand he'd thrown out to catch himself had not been enough. He was breathing. He was uninjured, technically. He was also, for the first time in longer than he could probably remember, looking up at someone. Ava did not raise her voice. "You will not touch me again," she said. The silence that followed was absolute. Then the man at the door, broad with a neck like a load-bearing wall, who she had clocked as security from her first shift, started moving, and behind him, 2 more. Ava set the coffee pot on the nearest surface, smoothed her apron, and walked toward the exit at a pace that was not running, because she did not run. She had made it to the service corridor before she heard Remy's voice behind her, low and quiet and carrying something in it that was worse than shouting. "Find out who she is." She had a room in East Vancouver, a single with a shared bathroom on the 2nd floor of a building that had stopped pretending to be nice sometime in the 90s. It was clean, which was what mattered. Theo was in the hospital 3 blocks away. Every night after her shift she walked to visit him, and every morning she walked back. The surgery, a spinal decompression, the result of a car accident 2 years ago that their insurance had not adequately covered, was scheduled for February 14th, which Theo had noted was Valentine's Day, and which he seemed to find cosmically funny. She let herself into her room, changed out of her uniform, and sat on the edge of the bed with her phone in her hands. She had 11 days left before 90. She just made herself a problem. She had known, taking the job, that this was the risk. Ava Renault was not, strictly speaking, the name she had been issued at birth. That name was attached to a record she could not afford to have surface. 3 years as a contractor for a federal intelligence unit that technically did not exist, a dismissal she had not agreed to, and an allegation of misconduct she had not committed. The allegation said she had leaked a source. The truth was that someone had used her access credentials to do it, while she was in hospital after a building collapse in Istanbul that had been staged to look like an accident. The person who had set her up was currently operating freely, because Ava was the only one who could prove it, and the proof was encrypted on a server she had not yet been able to reach. The server belonged to a man named Desmond Cork. Desmond Cork, as it happened, was Remy Daoust's financial director and had been for 11 years, which was why Ava had taken the job at the Meridian Club in the first place. She had not expected Remy Daoust to touch her. That was the variable she had failed to adequately weight. His name, when she'd heard it in another context entirely, had been spoken with the tone people reserved for geological formations. Remy Daoust, a thing that existed, that had always existed, around which other things arranged themselves. He had built Daoust Consolidated from a mid-sized construction company into a development entity that had reshaped parts of 3 Canadian cities. He was, depending on who you asked, either the most effective private builder in the country's recent history or the most effective private launderer of a particular kind of Pacific Corridor money. The truth, Ava suspected, was somewhere in the overlap. She had not planned to be on his radar. She had planned to stay invisible, gather what she needed from the server Desmond Cork accessed via the Meridian's private network, and disappear before anyone connected the name Ava Renault to anything. That plan had lasted 6 weeks. Her phone buzzed, a number she didn't recognize. She answered it anyway. "You should have run," said a voice. Male, low, unhurried. The same voice she had heard at the head of the table. Ava did not answer immediately. She was doing the calculation. How had he gotten this number, which one was on a SIM card she'd bought with cash from a gas station in Burnaby? "You're quiet," Remy Daoust said. "I find that interesting. What do you want, Mr. Daoust?" "What I always want, information. Specifically, who trained you, who sent you, and what you were doing in my dining room. I was refilling your coffee, Ava. He said her name like he was testing its weight. You dislocated 2 of my fingers. I have had trained professionals try to do that to me in a context where it was appropriate and they did not succeed. You did it with a coffee pot in your other hand. You are not a server. You grabbed me first, a pause. I did, he said. That's a fair point. The admission surprised her. She said nothing. I'm going to find out who you are regardless, he continued. My people are very good at that. The only question is whether you're there when they finish, or whether we have a more productive conversation first. I would prefer the second option. I'm told I'm easier to deal with when I've slept. You're calling me at 11:30. I haven't slept yet. Come to my office tomorrow. 10 o'clock. I'll have coffee, assuming you've forgiven the category. He hung up before she could answer. She did not go to his office. She went to the parkade beneath the Meridian Club at 7 in the morning, when the building's private network was least trafficked and the security staff were in the middle of a shift change. She had 40 minutes, she estimated. She needed 25. She was inside the server room off the service corridor, her tablet plugged into the hardline junction, when the door opened. It was not security. Remy Doust stood in the doorway in a grey wool coat, looking at her with the expression of a man who had been hoping to be right about something and had just confirmed it. Behind him, at a careful distance, was a man she recognized as his head of building operations, a tall, lean figure named Bertrand Ouellet, who she had observed on the property enough times to know he moved with military economy. I sent you the office invite at 7:05, Remy said, glancing at his watch. You didn't open it, so I thought I'd see where you actually were. He looked at the equipment in her hands. What is on that drive? Ava's mind ran the options in the time it took her to exhale. The tablet had its own encryption. The junction looked like a standard maintenance port if you didn't know what you were looking at. She had 60% of the transfer complete. Maintenance, she said, the maintenance team doesn't start until 9. I'm early. Ava. His voice was not loud. It was the opposite of loud. I watched the footage from last night 4 times. You didn't take a single step that wasn't chosen. You knew exactly where the exits were. You kept your back to the wall during service for 6 weeks. You are the most deliberate person I have encountered in recent memory, and I work with deliberate people for a living. He stepped into the room, letting the door fall shut behind him. Bertrand Ouellet stayed in the corridor. Whatever you're taking from that server, it's not about me. The transfer hit 80%. How do you know? She said. Because if it were about me, you'd already be gone. You're still here, which means you need something that's on that server that belongs to someone else. He looked at the junction port. Desmond Cork. The name landed in the room like a dropped weight. Ava said nothing. Remy studied her face. Desmond has worked for me for 11 years, he said carefully. What is he holding? The transfer will finish in 45 seconds, she said. If you have me removed before then, you'll never find out. If you let it run, I'll tell you what I know. It was a risk. It was the only play she had. Remy Doust looked at the tablet. He looked at her. He did not move. The transfer completed. Green confirmation on the screen. Ava unplugged the tablet and held it at her side. Desmond Cork has been running a parallel books operation through your Vancouver accounts for 4 years. He has a secondary income from a man named Harlan Greer, who uses your company's shell entities to move money that is not yours and not clean. And 3 years ago, when I was working a contract that was looking at Harlan Greer's network, someone used my access credentials to burn a source inside that network. I was blamed for it. I lost my position, my clearance, and my name. She paused. I have the log files from Cork's server. They show his device pinged into my access profile on the night the leak happened. I was in a hospital in Turkey. It wasn't me. The room was very quiet. You came into my club, Remy said slowly, to get evidence against my financial director, yes. By taking a job as a server and waiting for a moment to access the hardline, yes. And I accelerated your timeline last night by being... He stopped. His jaw moved. By being a problem, yes. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face that she had not expected. It was not anger and it was not calculation. It was closer to recognition. Cork has been billing ghost contracts through the Kelowna division, Remy said. I've had suspicions for 8 months. I couldn't prove anything without tipping him. He looked at the tablet in her hand. How much do you have? Enough to give to a Crown attorney. Enough to clear my file. And Harlan Greer. Greer is larger than Cork. Greer is the reason the source is dead. Something shifted in his expression. You knew the source. Ava did not answer that. She didn't need to. He read it in the shape of her silence. Come upstairs, Remy said. Not to detain you. I want to show you something. His office was on the 43rd floor, and the windows looked out over the entire span of the inlet. the mountains going grey-white in the November light, the container ships moving in stately procession toward the port. It was the kind of view that was designed to make other people feel small. Ava noticed it and filed it and turned her attention to the room. Bertrand de Ouellette entered a minute after they did, carrying a locked case that he placed on the table without a word. "My turn to show you something," Remy said. He opened the case. Inside was a hard drive and a set of printed financial records flagged in red. 8 months of internal audit, he said. Cork always explains the discrepancies. There's always a reason, a delayed invoice, a vendor dispute, a currency fluctuation. I'm not an accountant. I know when someone is comfortable lying to my face and when they're not. Cork is comfortable. He picked up the flagged sheets. What I don't have is a time-stamped trail that puts his hands on the original transaction, because everything he touches has a layer of plausible deniability between him and the decision. He looked at her tablet. "You do," he said, "the access logs." Ava understood what he was not saying. He was not asking her to share. He was showing her the shape of a problem and waiting to see if she recognized it as the same shape as hers. "If Greer knows Cork is compromised," Ava said, "he'll pull the files. Everything Cork has stored on your network will disappear." "Yes, how long before Cork reports to Greer about last night?" Remy's jaw tightened. "He was at the table. He saw you." Ava closed her eyes for 1 second. She had clocked the faces at the table, but she hadn't connected Cork to the man in the chair 3 seats from Remy. She had only ever seen Cork's name in documentation. She had not had a photograph. "He already knows I was there," she said, "almost certainly." She opened her eyes. "Then we have until he reaches Greer, which is probably tonight," Remy said. "Cork leaves for Calgary on a 7 p.m. flight. He books it every other Wednesday. I know because I sign his travel expenses." She looked at the clock on his wall. It was 9:48 in the morning. 9 hours, she said. Give or take. He folded his hands. He was watching her in a way that was different from how he had watched her the night before. Not assessing for weakness, but for something else. "I have the resources to move on Greer's Canadian operations within that window. Lawyers, a forensic accountant who has worked with RCMP, and a contact in the financial crimes unit who owes me a conversation. What I don't have is the log data that puts Cork inside your access profile." He paused. "What I'm offering is this. I use my resources to build the case against Greer and Cork simultaneously, in a way that is handed to the right people today. Your log data is part of that case. Your name is cleared because the timeline is irrefutable. And in exchange, you don't go to prison because you get ahead of the story about your company being used to launder money for 9 years, Ava said. He didn't flinch. "Yes, you knew it was happening. Not the specifics, but you knew the accounts were being used. I had suspicions I didn't investigate quickly enough." His voice was even. "That is the version I will give to the authorities, because it is the truth." Ava looked at him. She thought about Theo in the hospital, 3 blocks from her rented room. She thought about February 14th, and the sound her brother made when he talked about getting back on his feet, the specific quality of hopefulness in it that she had been trying to protect for 2 years. She thought about a source she had recruited in a city that wasn't safe, a woman who had trusted Ava's word that she would be protected, and who had died because someone had sold that word. "I want 2 things, Ava said. "Name them. I deal directly with your contact in financial crimes. You introduce us, and then you're not in the room. Done. The second, when this is finished, when the case is filed and my clearance is restored, I walk. No strings, no consultancy offer, no leveraged relationship, no expectation that I owe you anything for the introduction." Remy was quiet for a moment. He looked out at the inlet. "You think I'll try to hold this over you," he said. "It wasn't a question. I think men with resources often calculate favors as debt." He turned back to her. His expression was, for the first time, unguarded. Not vulnerable. She didn't think Remy Doust had access to vulnerability the way other people did, but clear. "Last night," he said, "I grabbed your wrist because I am accustomed to the world arranging itself to accommodate me. That is not a justification. It's a description." He picked up the flagged financial sheets and slid them into a folder. "I will not offer you the kind of apology that is really about making myself comfortable. What I'll tell you is that I've spent 9 hours thinking about the expression on your face. When you said last time, I'll say it gently. Not because you embarrassed me, though you did. Because I have not encountered someone genuinely unafraid of me in a very long time, and it reminded me that I have been operating in a very small room." He held out his hand. "Not to touch her. An offer. 2 conditions, both accepted. Let's work." The next 7 hours were the kind of work Ava had been trained for, and then spent 2 years pretending she'd forgotten how to do. They used a conference room on a floor below Remy's office, out of Cork's sightline if he came in. Bertrand de Ouellette turned out to have a background in corporate security that abutted hers in ways neither of them acknowledged aloud. The forensic accountant, a composed woman named Adrian Chow, arrived within the hour and understood the data structure of Ava's log files faster than Ava had expected. Remy stayed mostly in the periphery. He answered questions, provided access, made 2 phone calls in French that Ava caught enough of to understand were about containing the Kelowna situation. He did not try to run the room. She noted that. At 4 in the afternoon, Cork's assistant called up to say that Cork had left for the airport early. His 7 p.m. flight had been moved to a 4:45 departure. Ava was already across the room when Remy said, "It's handled." He was on his phone. Adrienne's contact flagged his travel document 20 minutes ago. He'll be met at security. She stopped. "You knew he'd move early. Cork is smart. Smart people don't wait." He set the phone down. "I asked Adrienne to move the flag to 3:30, just in case." Ava looked at him. "You could have told me that," she said. "I could have," he agreed. "I wanted to see if you'd moved on it yourself, and you were already across the room." The corner of his mouth shifted. "I find that reassuring." The confirmation came at 5:12. Cork had been detained at YVR and was cooperating, which meant Greer's Calgary contact was already aware. The Financial Crimes Unit opened a formal file at 6. Adrienne estimated a full picture within 72 hours, with Ava's log data forming the evidentiary spine. At 6:40, Adrienne looked up from her laptop and said, "The credentialing record is unambiguous. You were logged into a secure medical facility in Istanbul when the access event occurred. Cork's device signature is on the authentication trail. This will take 6 weeks to process properly, but the outcome is not in doubt." 2 years. Theo's accident, the apartment she'd had to leave, the name she'd had to step away from, the woman she hadn't been able to protect because someone had sold her out to save their own ledger. 6 weeks to process. Not in doubt. She exhaled. She was not aware that Remy had moved until he was standing beside her. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, which was, she understood, its own kind of acknowledgement. "I need to go see my brother," she said. "Of course." She gathered her tablet, the drive, the copies Adrienne had secured. At the door she paused. "You owe me a coffee," she said, not turning around. "You made me spill the one I was carrying." Behind her, after a moment, she heard something she had not heard from him before. A real laugh. Short, caught off guard, surprised out of him. "I'll have it ready," he said, "whenever you decide to come back." She walked to the elevator. The city spread out through the lobby windows, November dark, the lights of the North Shore reflecting off the inlet in long, wavering lines. She thought about Theo, who had a sense of humor about everything, who would ask her how she'd spent her Tuesday and would not believe a word of the answer. She thought about a room she'd planned to move through invisibly, and the moment she had stopped being invisible, and everything that had cascaded from that one unplanned second. She had come to the Meridian Club to retrieve her name. She was leaving with it. She was leaving with more than that, maybe. Some loosening in her chest, some sense of ground underfoot that she hadn't felt in 2 years. It was too soon to know what to do with it. But she had time, now. For the first time in a long time, she had time. She pushed through the lobby doors and walked into the cold Vancouver night, heading for the hospital, heading for her brother, heading, finally, somewhere that was not away. The woman who had walked into that dining room 6 weeks ago, carrying a coffee pot and a plan, had become someone who didn't need the plan anymore. She was still dangerous. She was still careful. She was still the most deliberate person in any room she entered. She just wasn't hiding anymore.